now is Galin Tihanov kind contribution, and I can even to see all his book about the birth and the death of literary theory was published, and I also very appreciated to see Galin, who are, as Michael Gordon, also our guest professor here in IGITI, Poletayev Institute, and I'm glad to give Galin the time of his contribution. We on the side of Poletayev Reading, we have also a short resume of Galin, Tihanov's, and Tatiana Venediktova's contribution also. Thank you, dear Galin.
I just wanted to begin with thanks to Alexander Dmitriev for this very kind introduction, but also to all of you at Vyshka for the invitation. It is always a great pleasure to be part of the Poletayev Readings. What I will say today is prefixed by the need to drive home this message that when I talk about theory, I mean by this a specific mode of thinking. And that means that the disappearance of literary theory or of theory with a capital T doesn't necessarily mean that we reject all other modes of thinking or reflecting on literature, on society, on religion, on economic life. With theory, I designate only one such mode of reflection or thinking. It is the recognition of the impurity of theory, its enmeshment in pragmatics, its orientation towards the production of a certain use value that takes us to the need to talk about the resistance to theory today. And I find several reasons for this resistance. It has everything to do, first of all, with the global transition to a new regime of knowledge production. Away from the disembodied thinking the West has been privileging for several centuries, and much more towards what one terms participatory knowledge, in which the practical situatedness and self-interest of the participants play a very important role. This important role we no longer seek to conceal, but are instead happy to emphasize and promote, foregrounding the legitimacy of this new mode of cognition that is pragmatic rather than disembodied and abstract. We should also take into account here the huge presence of the new social media, which have transformed our notion of truth and authority and have plunged us into a world of experiential modes of inquiry that are terribly self-centered and thus have little time for norms and criteria distilled in a bindingly rational and abstract manner. To this, finally, we have to add the enormous significance of migration and mobility, physical and virtual, that have brought home the message that the previously self-evidently valid Western cultural material, or pool of evidence, if you will, which would inform social and cultural theory for a very long time, is neither self-evident nor compellingly or universally valid. Of these three reasons, I want now to dwell in a little bit more detail on two. When it comes to literary theory in particular, and later on I will say a few things also about theory with a capital T, I have spent some time explicating the central reason for the resistance to it and eventually for its demise. This is a resistance to the various spectral appearances and forms theory has taken since the late 1980s. I argue that the main reason why literary theory is no longer possible in the concentrated and self-sufficient form in which it was possible until the 1980s is because literature itself has transitioned to a different regime of relevance that is no longer interested in it because of its specific features, that is, its autonomy as a discourse, and seeks instead to make various uses of it, to champion various social causes, to enter a cycle of self-therapy, or experience some entertainment. Or as Tatiana Venediktova very aptly puts it in her paper, literature has become an environment with which we interact. Literature itself can no longer be, in this new regime of its relevance, an object of distant contemplation, supported by the erotic energy stemming from the enduring attachment to a self-evident canon, some of it instantly available through memorization. Instead, it becomes a means. It is once again instrumentalized, and this pragmatic stance redefines our approach to it. Remember William James and the great lessons of American pragmatism. Truth cannot be argued over or distilled through disinterested procedures of contemplation or theorization, because truth is forever amalgamated with how we use things and to what ends. Literary theory, sustained as it was during the 70 or so years of its existence by a notion of detachment, distance, and the capacity for analysis that is always lifted above the horizon of utility or instrumentalization, crumbled in the face of this new regime of relevance that began to privilege the public or private utility of literature in ways that would refuse to derive this utility from its aesthetic or literary features. But there is also another reason I want to focus on today. And this second reason is valid with reference to both projects of theory that I call theory with a small t, literary theory, film theory, art theory, and so on, but also theory with a capital T, largely coinciding with 20th century continental philosophy. I return here to the relevance of exile and migration that I highlighted in my initial summary at the beginning. Theory as a project of Western modernity, which it is, for better or worse, has always been underwritten by a deeply held belief in the possibility of disembodied thinking. Precisely because of its disembodied nature, this thinking held a universalizing intent, which in turn would enter into a most unholy alliance with various projects of expansionism and colonization. In 1920, in Sofia, Nikolai Trubetskoy published a slender book called Европа и человечество, Europe and Mankind is the standard English translation of 1991. And this book is important for two reasons. Once, Trubetskoy argues that in its legitimate cultural diversity, humanity or mankind dwarfs Europe, is much larger than Europe. He thus provincializes Europe 80 years before the book of that title. But also crucially, Trubetskoy sends out the clear message that this disembodied thinking that theory rests upon is in the end illusionary. Yet theory has always been driven by this blind spot. Its claims to universality are possible because it finds itself historically sheltered, has been for a very long time, from the necessity to reflect on its own situatedness. Part of the story of disembodied and universalizing thinking is, for example, Hegel's phenomenology theory with a capital T, just as another part is the work of the Russian formalists theory with a small t. The formalists genuinely believed that the material they were reflecting on had universal significance and applicability. Thus, it didn't really occur to them to seriously test their hypothesis on samples of writing drawn from other cultural contexts. Arabic literature, Chinese literature, Sanskrit literature are all expunged from their literary Eden to a very large extent. For this, they were rightly criticized by one contemporary, the budding Orientalist at the time still a PhD student at Leningrad, Alexander Holodovich. The young Koreanist asked the formalists in earnest how they would afford to claim universal validity for their theoretical insights, given that the material on which their analyses were based was exclusively Western, European with a sprinkling of American literature. The difference between exile and migration becomes essential here. Exile is an individual experience. Migration places mobility in the frame of mass experience and thus gives us a very different prism on the encounters between the West and a whole number of powerful cultural zones in which literature functioned differently for centuries and was reflected upon with a different methodological toolkit, that of poetics rather than theory as such. And I think this is an important distinction, two very different forms of reflecting on literature. If we look at Shklovsky, Jakobson, Trubetskoy, Lukács, Auerbach, and countless other exiles, their experience of exile was no doubt an experience of cultural encounters with otherness, but this experience was still evolving in the relatively culturally homogeneous environment of the West. Europe and Russia, to me, on this count, is very much part of Europe, and America. Today's reality of mass migration confronts us with an altogether different experience. According to the United Nations, the number of migrants and refugees currently approaches 80 million. So let us imagine an entire country with a population the size of Germany or Turkey, unbound, relocated, and dispersed, sometimes forcefully, forming vast and unstable contact zones, conglomerates of cultural fluidity and heterogeneity. This experience of mass migration has fed into a sober recognition of a non-binding nature of the Western aesthetic and cultural experience. With this, theory has hit a buffer, reaching the limits of its own validity in how it identifies and seeks to reflect on phenomena that cannot be conceptually tamed with the frameworks of disembodied thinking. Evoking Adorno and Horkheimer, I would argue that what we could call the dialectic of globalization is a powerful factor in our current resistance to theory. Globalization has opened up the space beyond its initial and concomitant effects of leveling out and commodifying difference to an appreciation of the highly complex constitution of culture, of which the patterns and models worked out in the course of European and American history are anything but compelling or universal. In brief, the unprecedented mobility physical but crucially also virtual, which we have been living with since the start of the 21st century, has brought home the truth of the rather limited and conditional nature of the cultural inheritance which theory thrived on, by immersing itself in its riches in a way that was endearingly loyal at best and disturbingly naive throughout. COVID-19 will bequeath to us, when it eventually recedes into the background, a situation of heightened vulnerability of the Anthropocene belief in a human-centered, rational, and progressive West. The pandemic will have emphasized and radicalized various types of inequality and will have confronted us with a world of increasingly secondary virtual appropriations of reality. The larger implications of all this remain to be seen. One of the trepidations that fill the air as I speak is that underlying Western ideas could, as a result, find themselves in a state of precarity, from which only a very conditional recovery might be possible. The battles over theory, indeed the sweeping resistance to theory that we have been living with for several decades now, will be part of a larger landscape marked by a momentous redefinition of culture and the human. The journey doesn't promise to be necessarily comfortable, but it has every chance to be intellectually enticing. And I feel I should probably stop here and not abuse the time available to each of us. Thank you.
Thank you, Galin, for your contribution and very good starting point for our discussion. And now my deputies gives the word to Tatiana Venediktova and her vision of the same or maybe different subject, theory and post-theory. Thank you, Tatiana.
Thank you, Alexander, and I'm very grateful for the invitation to this intellectual feast, and I'm very grateful to Galin for the invitation that his talk today and also his book on the birth and death of literary history implied. That is to discuss literature in terms of its relevance. It's a very pragmatic category that can only be discussed in relative terms, of course. Since it's certainly from a certain point of view or in a certain perspective that we can form a judgment about the importance of anything whatever, or usefulness or value. So the sense of relevance would be of necessity reviewed and renewed and questioned and contested, and this is what we're doing today. So let me take up some of the arguments that Galin makes in his book. The history of ideas about literature, Galin writes, can be told as the history of attempts to conceptualize the changing regimes of its relevance. Historically, it appears there were three, and these can be very crudely defined as social, economic, and artistic. The first is the oldest. It probably came into being with written language itself and is still with us today. It would define literature as a means to convey ideas or knowledge of the world, to instigate socially oriented action, to disseminate ideology, and thus to support a particular order of values or a particular form of togetherness. There was yet another regime, a younger one, since it could only have come into being, it could not have come into being before printed matter became cheap and began to circulate widely. Before a literary work in the form of a novel was brought out into the market as a source of useful pleasure, a means of self-entertainment, of education, and self-help. Obviously, this first developed in Europe sometime in the 18th century, and today we observe something quite similar, except on a grander scale, on a global scale. Literature as a commodity is increasingly in competition with visual, audio, and VR products as digital media overtake the print. But what is of most interest to Galin, and incidentally to me too, is yet one more regime of literary relevance, and whether it's second or third, I could not say, since it was the latecomer, but also, according to Galin, proved to be most short-lived. It emerged first in the work of the Romantics, about 200 years ago. Then it continued through the years of aestheticism, l'art pour l'art, modernism, and finally came to fruition in the first decades after the First World War, and it was then that literary theory came into its own in Eastern Europe and in Russia. The relevance of literature in this paradigm was associated with its discursive uniqueness, its originality, its literariness. But then, as time passed, this regime dwindled and died sometime toward the end of the 80s, 1980s, or early 1990s. And literary theory, formalistic and structuralist, went along with it. It's a very interesting construction, very thought-inspiring. What I find extremely curious about this death of literary theory, as Galin describes it, is that it occurred while the first two regimes of literary relevance remained quite alive and in operation. And there's one more point of difference. In the first two cases, the judgment about literary relevance was made from beyond the institution of literature, on behalf of some entity like society or market forces or the like. While in the third case, literature's value is proclaimed from within, and it's supposed to be something intrinsic to literature as such. So it set me thinking, just why? Why should this project of literary autonomy have failed? Why does it cause resistance in the present day cultural climate? Because yes, indeed, and here one cannot but agree with Galin, the formalist insistence on literature's self-sufficiency feels no longer convincing. So is this some kind of fate, or what's working here? One of the reasons, I think, stems from the fact that the idea of literary sovereignty is rooted in the idea of individual sovereignty, in the presumed capacity of the romantic genius to transcendent vision and also mastery over language. We deal here with something, an attitude that Galin describes wonderfully as that of a prophet, I quote, a prophet, a transgressor, and an outcast, at loggerheads with Philistinism and utilitarian attitudes, end of quote. So it seems that a 20th century literary theorist of the formalist make does indeed expose these roots when claiming a uniquely penetrating vision into the ways language is deployed, in claiming that literature is the law unto itself, and also a territory of individual freedom, and also the patrimony and the refuge for this same figure of a theorist. One could only remind, we could only remind ourselves that this in the Romantic tradition, this self-reliant, supremely autonomous exile made himself object of irony in the same breath with proclaimed superiority. And today, in the world inhabited, as Galin reminds us, by 80 million exiles, also known as migrants, less romantically, this figure appears even more diminished because unexceptional, almost pathetically unexceptional. A human subject, it seems, is increasingly interesting to her and himself as a bundle of relations, not a self-enclosed monad, as somebody groundless and yet involved, constantly, passionately, unavoidably involved in the changeability of situation and context, as somebody always ever in dialogue with another. With this, there comes to the fore this curious attribute of an individual, whether a romantic individual or not so romantic, an attribute that John Keats described as negative capability, which is certainly not a claim to masterful knowledge. It is rather an ability to go without that, to accept, to quote Keats, uncertainties, mysteries, doubts, without an irritable reaching after fact and reason, end of quote. Incidentally, in humanistic discourse today, the term relevance occurs most prominently within the context of the so-called relevance theory. It was in the late 80s, that is, just at the time when literary theory, according to Galin, was coming to its end, that two linguists and also anthropologists, Dan Sperber and Deidre Wilson, first brought this hypothesis to public attention. And relevance, they defined as relation of interpretive effort and cognitive effect, a property key to human communication. Striving to minimize effort and also maximize the effect, to optimize relevance as such, us humans operate more or less successfully in the in-between space or in-between time of intersubjective experience. This space is fraught with risk. It's also rich in possibility. In this space-time, we invest trust. We also withdraw trust. We distribute and redistribute our resources of critical intellect, attention, and empathy. It's important to note that in this pragmatic light, language is no longer seen as a systematic code, nor is literary text seen as an autonomous object. Either is more like an environment, and thank you for quoting me, well, except it's not me, certainly Galin. It's something that we are immersed in and interact with, or else it's an instrument of cooperative social use. And the supreme challenge today, I think, is to theorize literature as this complex activity and field of action. So to sum it up, what do I have to say? I have to say that the demise of formalism ushered in, and it's pretty obvious, the nascence of theories in the plural, rather than indifference to theory as such, rather than turning away from theory, I think. The 3 decades after text-centered theory died, or supposedly died, what have we? We still have to make do with the rather carnivalesque attempts to make theoretic stabs at literature from every side and angle: feminist, cultural material, new historicist, ecological, you name it. The search for an integrative vision, like one offered by formalist theory, continues, and whether post-colonialism would provide some good ground for such an integration, something we discussed an hour ago, remains to be seen. Maybe yes, maybe no. But the very quest, paradoxically, keeps the romantic legacy alive, and Galin himself admits this in his recent paper as he writes, and I quote, "Romanticism, one may suggest, was an examination of modernity, a check on its performance, an inspection of its resources. Such an examination was bound to take place with renewed vigor in different circumstances every time a society and culture would find themselves at a critical juncture in their modern history," end of quote. Now that we find ourselves once again at a critical juncture, we ask ourselves once again about literature's relevance. That it serves the interests of the market, as well as the body's social and political, is pretty obvious, whether in the West or in the East, no matter. But don't these interests depend more than ever, even if very indirectly, on the interests and needs of a human individual? And aren't these interests of a human individual open to redefinition more than ever, might we say? So what we seem to have today is literature in search of a new definition of relevance, and literary theory no longer as scientific or as disembodied in its bearings as it used to be, but very much in search of a new subject, a subject which may prove to be indeed not literature per se, or literature in the bounds that we're used to, something else maybe, but it will be there. That's it. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Tatiana. And now I briefly give right to speak for Ilya Kukulin and then Sergei Zenkin. Ilya, please.
Thank you so much. Thank you, dear colleagues, for invitation to this very interesting discussion. Galin Tihanov invites us to return to the problem, or if you prefer, to the idea of resistance to theory, primarily set by Paul de Man, but now Galin presents this discussion on totally other ground. But frankly speaking, I think that the question now is not to how to resist to theory as an old-fashioned and too Eurocentric and too colonialist enterprise. I think that the main question now is in calling into question what can be called a theory or the theory or theory from the capital T today, and what can it be needed for and addressed to. I think that now we see some contradiction between the proposed resistance to theory discussed in a very interesting and very thought-provoking paper by Galin Tihanov, and the very widespread hope for all-encompassing big theory from the capital B and T. I'm thinking about object-oriented ontology, about theory of immaterialism by Graham Harman and many other theories, but they are thought, they are interpreted presumably as a continuation or reincarnation of the big theory of the 60s. I'm not sure that this is necessary. I think that the very rejection of such kind of theory or the desire to make theory great again, they are based, I beg to say, on too modernist vision of theory. I think that now theory is needed precisely due to the factors listed in Galin Tihanov's paper. Globalization, the mixture of migrants and other types of population who can be also migrants, but not in the first, but in second or third generation. I think that this this mixture of the very diverse kind of experience entails today's fetishization, over-valorization of experience expressed in literature. The most important thing in literature is now in criticism, in academic discussion, is the unusual or particular experience of otherness. I think that this valorization of experience of the otherness is very important, but the way it's made in today's academia can lead this valorization to rejection of any specificity of literary modality and literary expression. And I think that aesthetic expression as such, given that we are not going to return to modernist cult of aesthetic means, but this the means of expression are really important in mediation of one's experience and one's imagination. And I think that today I need communicative aesthetics of experience and communicative aesthetic of imagination. I think that it's important to study how and what for the socially defined experience can, what for the socially defined experience can be interpreted, represented, and potentially how this experience and imagination, how it can be shared. And this, in this point, I have to agree with Professor Venediktova's idea of intersubjective experience. I think that I wonder why the very fact of existence of Arabic and Hindu literatures should call into question the very possibility of literary theory as too Europocentric. This idea seems to be embedded in deeper presumptions that any theory today cannot meet an answer from another theory coming, say, from Africa or Latin America or from one of diasporas of circles of refugees. Why should we think in such a way? I would prefer to issue from a point of not predeterminedness of an answer, including the theoretical answer. I would prefer to develop the theoretical view as culturally relative and conditional, as limited with, say, my situation, my personal situation of a European university teacher living in a quite xenophobic society, the situation is limited with my body of cisgender white man and so on, but I'm ready to check my privilege. But I don't understand why this checking should block an opportunity to reflect what is literature and what can it be now in form of, say, study of communicative aesthetics of imagination and experience. Paul de Man interpreted resistance to theory as a necessity of permanent self-reflection, of a theorist, including, first of all, reflection of language and rhetoric organization of theoretical utterance, because this is, first of all, an utterance about other utterances. Now we need to interpret such resistance after Paul de Man and after Galin Tihanov's paper. I think that we need to interpret such resistance in the terms of checking our privileges and in the reflection of cultural, social, and maybe geographical place of a speaker, but as not the rejection of any opportunity to be the theorists. The numerous layers of reflection can be not the only shackles on the feet of a theorist, but the elements of his or her interpretation of literature as a sense-giving part of the wider reality. Thank you for your attention.
Thank you, Ilya. We have general discussion and for contributions of another participant. So please be coherent, and Sergei Zenkin will be next.
I like always to read Galin Tihanov's texts and to hear his talks. He knows how to put acute questions. What he did now, my task is not to criticize anything in his statement. I have nothing to criticize, but rather to interpret some of them, to rewrite them in some other conceptual languages very briefly. Galin's text has two main statements. The first one is literary, that is the new regime of relevance of literature. The second one is cultural, the abandonment of disembodied thinking, as he calls it. I will discuss them separately. So first, it is obvious that the status of literature has changed since a certain time. One can speak of a new regime of relevance, even if I don't discuss the term itself. What is interesting to me is the link, not the word. The new regime of relevance is determined by the changement of the dominant functions of literature. I refer obviously to the formalist theory of the dominanta, the dominant function of the text, and also for literature itself. There is the main dominant function of literature is no longer an aesthetic admiration, but Galin Tihanov states, more concrete and more utilitarian uses of literature. I quote here Rita Felsky. She, in instance, cites four of these uses: recognitions of one's own life, enchantment by a fictional word, knowledge of language, and moral or aesthetic shock. All these functions are not exactly aesthetic in the classic sense of the word. Literature seems to be instrumentalized. I quote now Galin's text. Literature can no longer be an object of distant contemplation, supported by the erotic energy stemming from the enduring attachment to a self-evident canon. Distant contemplation. There is another word, another term, telling approximately the same thing. Sacralization. A sacred object should be distanced and isolated from profane things and uses. For example, from non-canonical literary works in our case. The erotic or aesthetic attachment to a self-evident canon is just an attitude of the reader in front of the sacred. Now, literature seems to be desacralized, that is, to reduce it to its instrumental functions, like social activity, self-therapy, or entertainment. Now I refer to Galin's statement. Literary, and what is interesting, that literary studies were among different causes of this desacralization. There were different causes, of course, interplaying and superposing one onto another, but literary studies were among them. The literary history desacralized literature on the side of authors by disclosing the contingent circumstances of their creative work. And the literary theory did the same on the side of readers by displaying and emphasizing their freedom of interpretation, whereas a canonical text, a sacred text, may be only read in one way. Theory so accomplished a general task of the European science, the disenchantment of the world. It played a specific role that Antoine Compagnon has defined as the one of the opponent, a critic of dominant ideas and cultural practices. But all the parts of literature have not been, however, desacralized to the same degree. Poetry, for example, is still generally read as a quasi-sacral form of language, at the price of its lesser diffusion and audience compared to those of the more desacralized novel. That is the first Galin statement. The second. Galin points on the crisis of what he calls disembodied thinking in the humanities. That is a crisis of universal scholarly discourse, allegedly covering all the literary productions independently of different cultural traditions which they belong to. This issue necessitates a comment from the viewpoint of intellectual history, for it is not exactly new. An old problem of the world literature seems to appear beyond Galin's statement, but I will not discuss it, and I only remind you of when it began to be discussed. It was in the 19th century, as a reaction to the views of the previous period. And this previous period was called Enlightenment. In the Romantic epoch, the European authors got aware of the complex, non-universal structure of the human mind, opposing so to the Enlightenment way of thinking, which implied the existence of a reason with a capital, independent of any particular cultural and religious traditions. So, as early as in 1820, Joseph de Maistre, a declared enemy of the Enlightenment, proclaimed an irreducible diversity of the mankind, even in the limits of the civilized European world. I quote approximately, "I know the Frenchmen, the Germans, the Italians, and so on, but I know nothing about men." Joseph de Maistre was not a romantic, but he lived in an epoch which called in question the universalism of the Enlightenment. And he obviously seems to anticipate the crisis of the disembodied theoretical thinking we are living out now. The parallel between the 20th century literary theory and the Enlightenment thinking may be enriched and detailed. I did so a lot of time ago, so I remind some of my ideas. Both they tended to an encyclopedic, all-embracing discourse, more scientific in the 18th century, more humanist and politic in the 20th. The well-known outspreading of the theory, which having begun by literary studies, moved them then to an unlimited sphere of social and cultural issues. So then one can only explain what is theory of. This outspreading testifies of this general tendency of widening. Both Enlightenment and theory look towards the future and the progress, turning away from the past they criticized. Both they critically challenged the ancient prejudices and wanted a demystification of the human mind. Both they practiced intellectual radicalism, sometimes converging with the revolutionary tendencies in politics, the French Revolution or the May 68 movement. Both they were inclined to a literary style of writing, the secular, non-university philosophy of the Enlightenment, the avant-garde writing of some 20th century theorists. So, nowadays we apparently live through a kind of neo-romantic reaction to the neo-Enlightenment quasi-literary theory. But this is another issue to reflect upon. The word disembodied, utilized by Galin, seems to tell suggestively more than intended. By its inner form, it can refer to a non-incarnation, to a non-corporeal being. Indeed, the universal thinking inherited by us from the Enlightenment tends to reduce the empirical corporeal reality of the thinking subject. And Galin is quite right when citing against this tendency the radical empiricism of William James, taking into account the contingent experience underlying philosophical statements. Once again, we see that the debate continues since at least 100 years. But does it follow from it that the diverging cultural traditions were attempted to now are bodily? I think no. These traditions and cultural languages are no less virtual and disembodied than the universal thinker. They are determined by specific virtual structures that theory can and must explain. We deal here not with opaque and absolutely different bodies, but with once again, transparent intellectual structures, reducible to some common elements and grounds. In other words, the diversity of cultural traditions, historical and geographical, does not impede nor exclude the theoretical reflection, but rather provides it with a new object, including literary studies. What is an interesting question is the relationship between such relativist cultural study and the researches of philosophy, which seems to conserve now, in spite of all, a belief in the possibility of universal knowledge. And if so, discussing theory and its destiny leads us to a wider reflection upon the systemic interplay between different disciplines constituting what we name the humanities. Thank you for your attention.
Thank you, Sergei Nikolaevich. I see that our discussion is maybe devoted special conference, unfortunately online, but online format also give us the possibility to parallel discussion in the chat. And now in the chat, we are also debate the problem of language as central. Therefore, Galin Tihanov's book may be crucial point and the mark of the theory of literature, but maybe not only the theory of literature. And is the literature and the culture is special privileged subject of thinking and reasoning also is also our subject for discussion. And now the contribution of Anastasiya Bonch-Osmolovskaya, I suppose, give maybe another not so literary turn in our discussion today. Please.
I'm afraid I have also examples from literary theory, but still, I was thinking about the topics of this conference, of this roundtable, from the view of digital humanities, because this is my domain during the last years. And it was very interesting for me to write to read the pieces of Galin, Tihanov, and of Tatiana Venediktova, because I should say that digital humanities as the domain is the domain that which really suffers severely from the absence of theory, both from the big theory and small theories. And of course, first of all, it's a matter of self-esteem as being a kind of marginal and strange field, which is very expanding very fast, and I should say aggressively. This is somehow to it really lacks good opportunities to present itself. So and to speak on one language, on one meta language with those from the more conservative humanities domains. And another thing is pragmatic, because many studies in digital humanities are usually experimental studies. And when you are doing experimental studies, you do need this kind of hypothesis to be proved or disproved. So you do need some basis to ask a question, which you then need to find out. And thinking of the field in general, I think we can mention several ways of how to deal with this problem of atheoreticalness in modern literary studies and in modern humanities and in digital humanities especially. So one idea is kind of big return to Russian formalism, which Galin has mentioned, and which seems to have a kind of renaissance in digital humanities field. I should say that almost every presentation in the conference on digital humanities begins with the names of Prop and Shklovsky, as if it is Marx and English or Engels during Soviet times. But the idea is that the formalisms which were proposed by Russian formalist scholars can be maybe modeled computational, and then they may be repeated on a big massive of texts, and maybe some new results can be shown. I should say that here the theoretical basis is used like foundation, but I haven't heard really big breakthroughs which somehow evolve the theory. Another trend is, which seems to be rather interesting, is connected with different kind of computational engineering of digitalized cultural heritage. So this is a very big domain of digital humanities, where the idea is like, okay, we are kind of very high qualified humanities engineers and make it databases, or we make some kind of digital publishing, or maybe 3D models, and try to save and to curate cultural digital data and cultural objects. And that's a very interesting question. Does a technology needs a theory? And the most obvious answer would be no. So this is just, technology is just kind of protocolized process. But when we're at the state that, for example, if we're doing some digital edition or digital critical edition, we do need to answer many important theoretical problems. The first one, which is, what is the text? What is a text? Because or what the text is, yes, in the digital epoch, in the digital realization, the digital presentation, because there is a crucial difference between the paper text and the digital text, because in the digital form you can present the text with infinite levels, infinite layers, and you can present infinite text with infinite layers of its interpretation. And let me show you just one slide. I would like. So the idea is that the very important idea of theoretizing on this matter is that really documents and texts are entities outside of authors as real life individuals, and the texts in their cultural realms of transmission are by definition not faultless, but on the contrary prone to error. And so, and they are variable and principle always open. So as far as we have a digital edition, it is always open to numerous reinterpretations, which can be added as layers of this digital text and which can be all conserved in this digital text. And so this new technological idea is really a very interesting start of new thinking about what text is, what are the documents and the interpretation. And there is a very interesting theoretical discussion on this topic. I don't know, can be called a big theory with big T, probably not, but I think this is something new. And finally, another case which I would like to mention is the so-called data science on digitalized cultural heritage. So as far as we can have this kind of big data or smart data, there is also discussion what is a good data for experiments in humanities. But okay, we can have some data and then we can make some quantitative algorithmic models. So we could perhaps make some, so to say, objective observations, maybe some objective statistically valid correlations. And so we could use some mathematical algorithms to maybe get some new knowledge. And so this is the point where the theory is really crucial, because it is important to raise the questions. So what are you going to look for? What are you going to count? What are you going to compare? What are the main features of your model you are going to analyze? And another important thing of this big or small or still data science in humanities is that it usually deals not with canonic masterpieces, but usually with mass literature and with mass culture. So in general, so that leads us to this idea of literature as social, and even more as literature in its economic realm, yes? And what the main theory, which is, well, can have some interpretational force, is usually is cultural evolution or some kind of social theory. So I can also, let me just finish, but okay, I'll just mention. So for example, pamphlets of the Stanford Literary Lab are famous with their very interesting computational models of big massives of texts, and analysis of word distributions and their change through different genres and different some evolutionary process. And they do use some theoretical ideas to, because when they interpret the numbers they got, but usually they all lie in the field of some kind of social explanations. Like, for example, okay, we see decrease of moral terms in the Victorian literature, Victorian novels in England, when we compare them with earlier novels, because we do have industries and people move to cities, and so they don't want literature is much more entertainment, so they won't want to read about moral virtues, but they want to read detectives. And this theory really is a good theory to be experimentally investigated. But the question is it the only theory we can investigate with computational resources? So thank you for your attention.
Thank you, Anastasiya. And now Alexey Vdovin, if we with us have right to not last word, because Alexey Pleshkov and Sergei Kozlov reply would be the last.
Thank you very much, Alexander, for this invitation, and I'm very thankful to organizers of Poletayev Readings for this opportunity to say a couple of words. And of course, many thanks to Galin and Tatiana for the inspiring initial words on the fate of literary and other theories, by the way, as we saw in our chat. But my small remarks will be like notes from the field, not to mention notes from the underground. And I would like to speak from the position of literary scholar as literary historian, working in the field, not with maybe the big theories, but rather with material, and of course going from the material to theories and theorizing the material, and vice versa. And I have 3 points which are rather open questions for everyone, for myself. So to say, the first point is the question of terms. When I was reading Galin's text, I was thinking about the notion of the term theory. So Galin mentioned that we have at least 2 theories with small t and capital T. So with regard to theory with capital T, I rather fully second Tatiana Venediktova's opinion that now we have rather multiplicity of theories. And of course, no one single theory with capital T is longer possible. And as a grand narrative, as a grand big narrative, which dominated the field or fields in the first half of the 20th century. But at the same time, as a practitioner, as a, I would say, routine daily practitioner of literary history, I would prefer to be inside the multiplicity of theories, various approaches to the material, and not any grand narrative, not any one big theory. This was my first point. So the question of how can we theorize theories? So how can we categorize them? The second point is about, our second question, open question, is about, and it resonates, Anastasiya Bonch-Osmolovskaya previous talk. I would like to pay attention to recent, I would say, semi-utopian attempts making by some scholars, for example, Franco Moretti and his disciples and his followers, to offer, to pretend to provide a kind of a new big narrative. Quantitative formalism, so kind of reiteration of formalism, but it's not only quantitative, but as we know, it's also sociological, and it's a unique, to my mind, a unique combination or attempt to combine a sociological poetics with qualitative formalism. So I would consider this utopian in commerce. Utopian attempt, international and multidisciplinary attempt to build, to make a new grand narrative, new grand theory, or like historical poetics or quantitative historical poetics, and quantitative literary evolution, which combines and which involves various national literatures from all over the world, Arabic, Chinese, Japanese, African, and so on. And in this way, it this attempt tries to reestablish the formalism as a new and powerful means of literary studies. Of course, we have some restrictions here, and as you know, maybe recent article by N. Zada called Computational Case Against Literary Computational Studies shows the flaws and shortcomings of this approach. But still, if we are speaking about the current approaches to produce a new big theory, we have to deal with this big movement in cultural and literary studies, to my mind. And my last point and question is institutional framework. Nobody told tonight about this frame, this angle of problem of theory, but at the same time, and meanwhile, we are still living in this institutional context, and we have problems, issues with disciplinarity as such, ascribing ours to various departments inside the universities, and it's with problems of power and distribution of power between and inside the fields. And speaking about theories and with capital T and small t, we need to speak, of course, about the distribution of power inside the academia. And I think it's a big issue and problem for all of us, not only in Russia, because we see that the amount of literary departments is diminishing, and it's a trend. So that's why it's another reason to think about the relevance of theories, I would say. So that's all. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Alexey. And now Alexey Pleshkov help us to hear Sergei Kozlov's contributions also. Please, Alexey.
I believe that Sergei Kozlov's comment will maybe make some extensions of discussion and, bring it back not only literary theory, but humanities in more general sense. And as I read it, so I believe that it resonates quite a lot to Sergei Zenkin's contribution. But from now, I'm just reading what Sergei Kozlov, what he wanted to say. So I'm starting to read the comment. I'm very grateful to Galin Tihanov for his acute and very stimulating reflections about the issues which concern all of us. At the same time, I must admit that I found myself with somewhat ambiguous feelings about his thesis. These feelings of mine were a mixture of deep accord and of recurrent uncertainty. I would like to emphasize that the word uncertainty is by no means a polite substitute for disagreement. It is exactly uncertainty, a combination of doubts unresolved and questions unanswered. My accord with Galin Tihanov is situated on macro level. It concerns the general picture of the dynamics of the last century taken from a very distant point of view. Indeed, what we all see from this distant point of view is a big configuration of intellectual and cultural attitudes. Let us say the configuration M with capital M, being gradually replaced by another big configuration, let us say the configuration PM. My feeling of uncertainty begins with when Galin Tihanov tries to get closer to reduce, I'm sorry, my feeling of uncertainty begins when Tihanov tries to get closer and to reduce the characteristics of this process to a limited number of actants, literary theory, and determinants, migration and globalization, and chronologically boundaries, the 1980s and the 1990s. It is clear that what Galin Tihanov sought to deliver in his book about the birth and death of literary theory was specifically a Russian projection of the universally Western cultural process of the end of modernity. His thesis for today's symposium is the continuation of his book. Meanwhile, the same big process of intellectual change, replacement of M by PM, yields to other projections, and we don't know the exact number of such possible projections. Every such projection proposes its own actants, its own causal determinants, and its own chronological boundaries. I shall cite two French examples. The first was given by Jean-Claude Milnier in his paper Le Savoir comme Idole, which was later developed in his book Le Juif de Savoir. According to Milner, what we see in the 20th century is a replacement of absolute knowledge or Wissenschaft, typical of the 19th century, by a combination of Technik in the Heideggerian sense and limited specific pragmatically oriented sciences. The absolute knowledge, as described by Milner, is very close to disembodied thinking, as described by Galin Tihanov. The other term of the dichotomy, the pragmatically oriented knowledge, is also similar in both cases. But Milner gives a conceptualization of the specific actors of absolute knowledge, which is different from Tihanov's. For Milner, the most specific fraction of the masters of absolute knowledge of the end of the 19th, beginning of the 20th century are the assimilated Jews. What is important for Milner is the Jewishness which they pretended to substitute with their universalism. Respectively, the catastrophe of the absolute knowledge is determined for him by the catastrophe of the assimilated European Jewry. The triumph of the Technik are the gas chambers. The decisive chronological boundary is pushed by Milner back to the 1940s. The second example was given by the late Marc Fumeroli in his public statements which concerned the defense of the humanities. All such statements have now been collected in Pour les Humanités. Fumeroli was the main figure of the rhetorical turn in the French literary studies of the last 40 years. He has definitively debunked the structuralism in the French literary studies. The publication of his first and most famous book, L'Âge de l'éloquence, has coincided with the death of Roland Barthes. The coincidence was symbolic. Fumeroli was the partisan of the Humanités, the Studia Humanitatis, as opposed to the Sciences Humaines. Scientism was Fumeroli's worst enemy. He would agree with Galin Tihanov about the disembodied thinking. He perceived the disembodied thinking of the human sciences as the main danger for the future of European culture. He would also agree with Galin Tihanov about the 1980s and the 1990s as the decisive chronological boundary. But he would disagree with Galin Tihanov about the main factor of this intellectual change. Fumaroli has always stressed the narrow ties between scientism and progressist, i.e. leftist ideologies. So the main factor which determined the possibility and the necessity of the return from the human sciences to the humanities was for Fumaroli the all-European crash of Marxism. It seems to me that it is hardly possible to privilege one of these three perspectives, and consequently these narratives, over the others. Maybe it would be rather have been desirable to take into account the plurality of such perspectives in order to delimitate more accurately and explicitly the specificity of one's own approach. That's what Sergei Kozlov's comment was about.
Thank you. We have very profound and interesting, but limited by the time limits frame discussion, and our parallel Zoom conversation during this session was about the only the literature would be the main point of this atheoretical or post-theoretical term. So I suppose maybe as a bridge to our next discussion with Dmitry Burakin and specialist in cultural studies and also sociology, maybe the social theory or even economic theory as also human sciences would be another example of theory and theory debate now.
It was a very interesting discussion, and there was so many different angles brought up, and certainly I'm not in a position to sum any of it up. I'd like to, the only thing I'd like to say is that it seems to me there are two catches in this conversation about what do we do with theory today. And catch number one is that is our proneness to oppositions, to binary oppositions, to setting literature as a quasi-sacred object against literature as a profane instrument, or the materiality of literary uses against aesthetics. I don't think we need that. It's rather more useful to broaden, to think of uses in broader terms, and also of aesthetics in broader terms. And of course, Alexander Baumgarten was the first to emphasize aesthetics as embodied thinking. I think this would be more productive. And catch number two, I think, is our attempt, and it was brought up interestingly in Alexey Vdovin's contribution a few minutes ago. Sometimes we're trying to use theory to make up, or try to make up, for the relative powerlessness of the humanities, which is the condition of humanities anywhere in the world, not in Russia only. And I really have reservations about this, claims described in relation to quantitative formalism, claims to bigness and grandness, because, that kind of global embrace may be stifling for thought. I also, can only express reservations about using theory in our institutional struggles about power, because, of course, we lack power much of the time. But then the best definition of theory that I know and that I tend to use comes not from comes from a poet. The poet's name is Wallace Stevens. And I think the best definition of theory is what he also described as supreme fiction. What he had to say about supreme fiction are three things, essentially. It's more, but I'd only emphasize three. One, it must be abstract. It gives us an opportunity to distance from a subject and have some freedom of maneuver to play with it intellectually. Two, it must change, and no theory builds a mausoleum for ideas. And three, it must give pleasure. It gives us intellectual pleasure for very serious play. It only means, I guess, that seductions of pleasure I feel as more powerful than seductions of power, but I think it's this that would make theory appealing and interesting to our students. Thank you.
I can only agree with that in the sense that theory has to be taught. But we have to teach theory in such a way as to help students recognize that the theory is not innocent when it comes to power. A lot of power resides in theory historically, and if you look at Eastern Europe and Russia, this is how all these faculties of philology used to be structured. Theory departments would occupy a position of authority entirely of their own. And I don't think this would necessarily be a healthy solution today. But I entirely agree with Alexey Vdovin that, of course, we should be teaching theory, whether as part of intellectual history. And today we had some very good examples of how you can look at history through that particular prism, or in some other way. It should certainly have a place in our curricula. And when he says that he feels comfortable in this plurality of various theories with a big T, I think this is perfectly understandable, because we are all of us, the product of a particular educational system that would engage very closely with theory, thus understood, and would transmit this knowledge, and we would be trained to be at home. But I think we are increasingly in contact with new generations that do not feel at home in theory, even when we try to teach them to do so. So there is a lot of work there to be done to retain the impulse of theory without lending excessive authority or power to theory, and without fetishizing it, I suppose. I very briefly on Anastasiya Bonch-Osmolovskaya's statement. I agree that there was this conference which colleagues would know about at Stanford some years ago on Russian formalism and the digital humanities. And those of us who were there and spoke at this conference, we all concluded that this marriage did not take place. There was very little that we were able to establish in common between the formalist drive or the literary theory drive and the digital humanities drive. So there are potential overlaps, but I agree with Anastasiya, and also I think Alexey Vdovin spoke about this. There are also gaps that we cannot bridge so easily. I will come to Sergei Zenkin's and Sergei Kozlov's comments in a minute. Ilya Kukulin, and I'm sorry I have to respond in his absence, but the original text on which this statement is based does actually begin with a gesture to Paul de Man. Of course, if you choose as the title of your paper, Resistance to Theory, you have to do that. But with de Man, of course, the situation is entirely different. And his skepticism towards theory is grounded entirely in this deconstructive suspicion of language. It is not about the factors that we are discussing together tonight. There is probably a thirst for big theory still somewhere in the West, which Ilya Kukulin speaks about. If you go to China, you actually discover that in China there is extreme caution with regard to theory. And they actually still believe that aesthetic experience and the history in which this aesthetic experience has come about to be so unique in many ways that they fear that if they were to begin to articulate this experience in terms of theory and reflect on it in terms of theory as we in the West would expect them to do, this would place them in a position where they have to actually give up this uniqueness and to in many ways leave behind this claim to a cultural Sonderweg. And I don't think this skepticism towards theory that I'm trying to capture and find the reasons for actually amounts to denying any one individual the right to practice theory. What I'm trying to say is that precisely because of the different place Arabic and Sanskrit and Chinese literature have historically occupied in their respective cultures, if you want to theorize even these literatures from the point of view of to reflect on them theoretically, you would probably be defeating the purpose of the exercise, because in these cultures, historically, for very good historical reasons, theory has not been in demand. What has been in demand and has been developed with great deal of sophistication in these cultures is poetics, but this is a very different proposition. Poetics and literary theory in the formalist incarnation have some points of contact. They are hermetic, they believe in the self-sufficiency of the text, but this autonomy of the literary text in literary theory is an outcome. It is a realization that literature has become autonomous, having been tested vis-a-vis this great test of where it belongs in society, with power or against power, with religion or against the infrastructure of religion. Poetics believe in the self-sufficiency of literature, and I write about this in another text, is the belief led by the assumption that the literary text has not become autonomous. It has always been such. And why this is the case in the Middle East and in China, we can expand upon historically with very precise indicators of the fundamentally different relationship between literature and state power on the one hand and literature and religion on the other hand. Which brings me to the set of comments by Sergei Zenkin and Sergei Kozlov, which I greatly enjoyed. I think the immediate point of departure here is this idea of this sacredness versus the profaneness of literature. And I know Sergei Zenkin has written on this, and I have a great deal of time for this and a great deal of sympathy for these arguments. To me, this translates somewhat differently into the debate on the secularization of European culture as the springboard for what we later would come to call theory. And the Enlightenment is indeed a crucial point here, but I still think that this opposition between Enlightenment and Romanticism is probably a little bit too stark, because in the end, if you look at, let's say, cosmopolitanism, there are two very different versions at the end of the 18th century. You might label one of them Enlightenment version, and this is Kant, cosmopolitanism as a political proposal, and the other one you might label Romantic, Herder, and cosmopolitanism that is culturally and language-based. But in the end, they both share this drive towards a certain universalism and this belief that you can capture and translate reliably cultural difference. Fundamentally, and this is very much also true of how I see Sergei Kozlov's argument, fundamentally, whether you establish predecessors is an interesting work. It would nuance some of the arguments. It would probably give added richness to the texture of the arguments. But in the end, this genealogical approach is neither here nor there when it comes to the arguments why today theory is under pressure, both with capital T and with a small t. But I would be very interested to read some of the work that Sergei Kozlov refers to and to engage with it too. So I actually, the long and the short of all this is that I find myself so much in agreement with so much that has been said. And I also have to say it is a very humbling experience to get so many excellent responses and so much food for thought that would help me refine my argument. So thank you again, and I'm sorry if I didn't engage with every detail. The responses were really very, very rich. Thank you.
Мне хотелось бы обратить внимание, помимо всего того, о чем говорилось, что Галин все-таки говорил об одном виде, об одной из теорий. И меня удивило, что мы говорили сразу обо всем, а стоило бы, наверное, обсудить причины, как это начала Татьяна Венедиктова, обсудить причины ухода этой теории. И помимо того, о чем было сказано и двумя Сергеями, и всеми остальными, меня удивило то, что ничего не говорилось, почти ничего не говорилось о политическом и социальном контексте. То есть говорилось, может быть, что-то о более глубоких корнях этих изменений, но, скажем, о радикальном левом повороте, характерном для современного общества, что у нас, что не у нас, а на Западе, откуда, собственно, проистекают эти тенденции. Может быть, стоило бы подумать и об этом, и о том, что опыт другого, о котором говорил Илья Кукулин, изучается прежде, почему-то подхвачен именно левыми течениями, и что правые отвечают им в большой степени в качестве реакции на это засилие левого дискурса, то есть на то, что происходит с либеральным дискурсом на этом фоне, и не стоит ли посмотреть на прагматизацию литературы, о которой, собственно, изначально шла речь, с этой очень простой, примитивной и, казалось бы, поверхностной точки зрения, и подумать, как вот эта интерсубъективность, о которой Татьяна говорила, влияет на этот политический контекст. То есть, может быть, вопреки тому, что я обычно делаю, я в данном случае хотел бы обратить внимание вот на такие простые идеологические вещи, которые, наверное, на это влияют. Когда мы говорим о том, что мы больше не воспринимаем литературу как литературу, а воспринимаем ее прагматически. И когда у нас изымают там запрещают какие-то произведения, потому что в них нарушаются права там, тех или иных видов меньшинств, то почему мы можем позволить себе, как это не скучно, игнорировать вот такие простые очень, а может быть, не очень простые вещи. Может быть, это бы стоило тоже обсуждать.
Спасибо. По-моему, это лучший переход к разговору о неравенстве, который нас ожидает уже через 15 минут. Да? Спасибо всем. Спасибо, Галин. Вот, и очень надеюсь скоро увидеться в нашем марафоне. Андрею Владимировичу Полетаеву, надеюсь, понравилось и было бы не скучно. Спасибо.